before men even saw it, they heard it. A distant wail that grew into a scream, mechanical, inhuman, and alive. The pitch rose higher and higher until it clawed at the nerves, setting off an instinct older than language. Soldiers threw themselves to the ground. Civilians froze in terror. Then came the explosion, the ground ripping open as bombs fell, and the scream died away into silence. That sound was the voice of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. In the first years of World War II, it was the terror of the sky, the iron vulture of the Third Reich, a weapon designed not just to destroy, but to humiliate and terrify. Wherever it flew, panic followed. Newspapers called it the siren of death. To the Wehrmacht, it was the sound of victory. But inside the black and white propaganda films, beneath the triumphant marches and the camera shots of bombs striking targets with eerie precision, the truth was different. The Stuka was not made of indestructible steel, but of thin aluminum sheeting, little thicker than a coin. The fuselage could be pierced by machine gun fire. The cockpit, barely protected, relied more on luck than metal. Its engine, a 1,200-horsepower Umo 211, strained to push its squat, angular body through the air at just over 240 miles per hour. A Spitfire could fly 50 miles an hour faster and climb twice as fast. Yet, in 1939 and 1940, none of that mattered, because in those years, the Stuka never faced an equal. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Polish biplanes and French fighters were obsolete before they even took off. Against an undefended sky, the Ju-87's weaknesses were invisible. Its slow speed meant precise aim. Its fixed landing gear meant it could take off from fields too rough for faster planes. The dive brakes, flaps that extended from the wings, allowed it to plunge nearly vertically without disintegrating. The Germans built entire tactics around it, blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks broke through enemy lines while Stukas bombed bridges and supply routes ahead of them. Ground forces called them angels, enemies called them demons. To the soldiers below, it didn't matter that its armor was paper-thin. It didn't matter that the cockpit shook so violently during a dive that pilots often blacked out. The only thing anyone heard was that scream, and then silence. One British officer who survived Dunkirk wrote later in his diary, "The sirens begin, and you think of your mother. You cannot move, cannot breathe. Then the bombs hit, and you thank God for the noise, because it means you're still alive." For Hitler's propaganda machine, the Stuka became the symbol of unstoppable power. Newsreels showed it as divine judgment descending from the clouds. The truth was that it was a single-purpose weapon, dependent on complete air superiority. But myth doesn't need truth, it only needs timing. By the summer of 1940, the Stuka's cry had become synonymous with German victory. The Luftwaffe's dive bombers turned Europe into an orchestra of terror. Warsaw, Oslo, Rotterdam, Calais. The Allies had no answer. And yet, even as its legend grew, cracks were forming in the myth. Pilots complained of vibrations so intense that rivets worked loose after just a few sorties. Maintenance crews patched torn metal with whatever they could find. Many Stukas carried only 2 radios for both navigation and combat coordination, and even those often failed in bad weather. Still, the pilots flew on, certain of their dominance. One Luftwaffe mechanic later confessed, "We knew she was fragile, but she was ours. She was German. And in those days, we thought German meant perfect." The illusion held until the sky turned against them. In August 1940, over the English Channel, the Stuka met its first real enemy, the Royal Air Force. What happened next would end the myth of the invincible dive bomber and reveal for the first time just how thin the armor of the Iron Vulture truly was. The sound that had once terrified the world was about to be drowned out by the roar of British engines and the reality of modern air combat.
By the summer of 1940, the Stuka scream had become a weapon in itself, the opening note of Germany's symphony of conquest. From Warsaw to Paris, its howling dives announced the fall of cities. To the German public, it was a symbol of destiny, an angel of lightning that made the Reich untouchable. The newsreel showed sleek formations plunging from blue skies, bombs striking with impossible precision, and crews saluting beneath black crosses painted on silver wings. But above the English Channel, that illusion met its reckoning. July 1940, the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe had promised Hitler that the Royal Air Force would be destroyed in weeks. "The Stukas will clear the way," said Goering. "No Englishman will dare look to the sky." And for a few days, it seemed true. Stukas hit radar towers, airfields, and coastal convoys. Their accuracy was unmatched. A bomb through a hangar door. A destroyer struck square amidships. The British press described swarms of shrieking monsters descending like vultures. But then came the fighters. The Stuka was never built for a fair fight. It was slow, heavy, and blind from behind. When the first Spitfires and Hurricanes intercepted them over Dover, the sky turned into a slaughterhouse. Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Wellham of No. 92 Squadron, RAF, described his first encounter. "They came down in perfect order, textbook stuff, diving straight for the harbor. Then we came at them head-on. They couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't run. You just picked one and stayed on him until he burned." Within a week, Stuka losses were catastrophic. Whole squadrons vanished in minutes. The dive bombers that had crushed Poland and France now fell in flames into the English Channel, one after another. In one raid on Portland Harbor, 18 Stukas went in. Only 4 came back. For the first time, the Germans realized what their enemies had long suspected. The Iron Vulture was made of paper. Inside the wreckage recovered from the Channel, British intelligence officers made a shocking discovery. The aircraft's fuselage, supposedly armored, was barely 3 millimeters thick. The cockpit sides were reinforced with thin steel plates, but the rest was nothing more than pressed aluminum. Bullets from rifle-caliber guns could pass straight through. The vaunted invincible Stuka was little more than a flying target. The British pilots soon learned its weaknesses by heart. Attack from above or behind, aim for the radiator, then for the pilot. The gull-shaped wings that gave it stability in a dive made it clumsy in a turn. The fixed landing gear slowed it down. Once caught in open sky, a Stuka was doomed. Still, Goering refused to see the truth. "It is not the machine," he told his commanders. "It is the men." But his pilots knew better. They flew their missions like condemned men, knowing that speed, their only real armor, was something they did not have. Even Hans Ulrich Rudol, who would later become the most famous Stuka pilot of all, admitted that the aircraft was hopeless in the wrong sky. "In a dive, she was a weapon," he wrote. "Out of one, she was prey." After the Battle of Britain, the Stuka disappeared from Western skies. Those that survived were sent south, to the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and the deserts of North Africa, where the Luftwaffe could still find skies free of enemy fighters. In these new theaters, the Stuka regained its purpose, striking British supply lines, convoys, and desert outposts. The pilots felt the old pride returning. "Africa," one wrote in his logbook, "is made for the Stuka. Open sky, open earth, and no Spitfires." But even there, cracks showed through. The sand clogged the air filters, the heat warped the thin metal panels, and the relentless sun exposed every weakness of its crude construction. The Stuka's radio systems, already unreliable, failed constantly in the heat. Crews often flew missions without communication, relying only on hand signals and faith. The plane that had once defined blitzkrieg was becoming a relic in real time. By 1942, even the Germans were beginning to question the myth. Allied technology was evolving faster than German pride could admit. American-built P-40 Warhawks and British Kittyhawks now roamed the North African skies. Against these faster, more powerful aircraft, the Stuka was hopelessly outclassed. Yet still, it flew. The Stuka's reputation, carefully built by years of propaganda, kept it alive. It was the favorite of Hitler himself, who saw it as a symbol of Germany's willpower. The Stuka, he once said, is the embodiment of the German soul, precise, fearless, and unstoppable. But the truth was darker. Behind every dive, every shriek of the Jericho trumpet, was a pilot sweating in a cockpit held together by bolts and luck. They trusted the machine. They had to. But each knew one burst of machine gun fire could tear through the fuselage like paper. The engineers in Berlin worked to improve the armor, adding a few more millimeters of steel around the cockpit and engine, but it made little difference. The extra weight slowed the Stuka even further, turning it from predator to lumbering target. A cruel irony. Every attempt to make the iron vulture stronger only made it easier to kill. Still, for all its flaws, the Stuka refused to vanish. Its legend lived on, not in its aluminum skin, but in the psychology it created. Even after the Battle of Britain, Allied troops still flinched when they heard a diving whistle. The Luftwaffe had discovered something more powerful than armor: fear. But fear only works one way. By 1942, the Allies were no longer afraid. They had seen the wreckage, touched the thin metal, and realized the truth. The Stuka was a weapon of the past, a ghost carried forward by habit and pride. And in the deserts of North Africa, the Americans were about to see that truth for themselves when they captured the remains of those same screaming demons and found beneath the black crosses and slogans nothing but sheet metal and faith.
The desert had no mercy. What snow had hidden on the Russian front, the African sun revealed in merciless detail. Every flaw, every weakness, every lie of German engineering myth. By early 1943, the once proud Luftwaffe was retreating westward across Tunisia. Their airfields at Kasserine, Gaibes, and El Guetar were crumbling under constant Allied bombardment. In their wake, the Germans left behind burned-out trucks, shattered tanks, and for the first time, dozens of wrecked Ju-87 Stukas. For American troops advancing through the ruins, it was like stumbling upon the carcass of a legendary beast. These were the same planes that had haunted the early years of the war, the shrieking vultures of Poland and France. Soldiers stopped to stare at them, half expecting one to suddenly lift its crooked wings and scream again. But the monsters were dead, and their bodies told a different story. Captain William Bill Harkness of the U.S. Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Unit crouched beside the twisted remains of a Stuka outside Kasserine Pass. The aircraft had crash-landed half buried in sand, its nose bent, its propeller blades twisted like soft clay. He ran his gloved hand along the torn fuselage and stopped. "Get me the calipers," he said. An assistant handed him a measuring tool. Harkness pressed it against the jagged edge of the armor. He looked up, incredulous. 3 millimeters? That's nothing. His team exchanged looks. 3 millimeters, about the thickness of a coin. They peeled back another panel near the cockpit. The sunlight caught the bare metal. Dull, cheap, thin. Harkness could flex it with his hands. "This isn't armor," he said. "It's roofing metal." Nearby, Sergeant Joe Mitchell, an aircraft mechanic from Kansas, who'd spent years working on P-40 Warhawks, poked at the engine housing with a screwdriver. "UMO 211, he said. "Looks fancy, but damn, it's a mess. One hit in this and it'd seize right up." He pointed to a shattered oil cooler under the nose. "They didn't even shield it properly. A rifle round would take this out." The team began dismantling the wreck carefully. What they found confirmed their disbelief. The Jericho trumpets, those infamous sirens, were nothing more than small propeller-driven horns bolted onto the landing gear, crude and unprotected. The radios were heavy and outdated, their circuits burned out by heat. The wiring was sloppy, the insulation cracking in the desert air. "This is what terrorized Europe? A tin can?" one of them said. Harkness didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the bomb rack, a simple welded frame held together with bolts that looked handmade. "Look at this," he said quietly. "They built it to dive perfectly, but not to survive long." The wreckage was transported to a makeshift Allied airstrip near Tebessa, where American engineers examined it under shade tents flapping in the hot wind. Reporters passing through later wrote that they looked like surgeons dissecting a myth. The first detailed report to Allied command was short, but sharp. Ju-87 dive bomber examined at Kasserine region. Armor protection minimal. Wing plating 2 to 3 millimeters aluminum. Engine vulnerable to small arms fire. Radio and hydraulic systems crude and unreliable under high heat. Performance heavily dependent on air superiority. In other words, the Iron Vulture had never been iron. A few days later, one of the wrecks was brought by truck to a captured German airfield near El Gaitar, where under the scorching sun, mechanics from the U.S. 79th Fighter Group reassembled it enough to test its systems. Sergeant Mitchell climbed into the cockpit. The seat was cramped and unpadded, the instruments labeled in Gothic script. He turned the knobs on the radio. Nothing but static. He pushed the control column, stiff, unresponsive. "Feels like I'm driving a tractor," he joked. A British officer watching nearby nodded grimly. "That's exactly what it is, a flying tractor, built to dive and die." When they removed one of the wings, they were stunned to find patches of wood framing and fabric under the outer metal skin. Parts of the control surfaces, elevators, and ailerons were literally canvas stretched over lightmate ribs. "This thing was held together by paint," Mitchell muttered. And yet, it had once ruled the sky. That paradox fascinated the engineers. How could something so primitive inspire such terror? The answer, they realized, was not in the metal, but in the mind. The Stuka's deadliest weapon had always been psychological. Its scream, the Jericho trumpet, had been specifically engineered to terrify. Pilots had reported Allied troops freezing in panic when they heard it. Even now, as one engineer spun the propeller of a recovered siren, that familiar banshee wail echoed across the desert. The men fell silent, goosebumps rising despite the heat. "That sound," Harkness said quietly, "it's worth more than any bomb." By April 1943, the technical analysis of the Stuka was complete. The Americans had learned that beneath its terrifying legend, it was a relic, efficient only when the sky belonged entirely to it. Once the Allies gained control of the air, its weaknesses became fatal. "The Stuka," the final report concluded, "is an anachronism, a masterpiece of discipline, not design." Even so, some of the American pilots who studied it came away with a grudging respect. "You can't fault the men who flew these things," one of them wrote in his diary. "It took guts to dive straight down at the ground in a tin coffin like that." When the 9th Air Force pushed further east, Harkness ordered one of the captured Stukas to be shipped back to the United States for display. On its fuselage, an unknown soldier scrawled in chalk before the plane was loaded, "The Fear Machine, built from faith and scrap." Months later, under the dry sky of Tunisia, the wrecks remained, rusting, half buried in sand. The local shepherds used their wings for shade. The sun burned away the paint, revealing raw metal, dull and thin. The engineers had left, but their discovery stayed with them. The Stuka's terror was never in its armor. It was in the minds of those who heard it coming, and the faith of those who flew it down. The wreckage of the Stuka may have revealed weakness in metal, but the men who flew it were forged from something harder. For all its flaws, the thin armor, the clumsy frame, the hopeless speed, The Junkers U-87 still lived and killed through one thing the engineers could not measure: belief. The Stuka was not a machine of steel. It was a machine of willpower. Its pilots fought not with superiority, but with certainty. No one embodied that contradiction more completely than Hans Ulrich Rudel. Born in Silesia in 1916, Rudel was an athlete before he was a soldier, the kind of man who seemed to live only for extremes. When war came, he volunteered for dive bombers, fascinated by the idea of falling from heaven like a hammer. His early commanders thought him reckless. They were right. Rudel practiced dives steeper than regulations allowed, 80, sometimes 85 degrees, his aircraft trembling on the edge of structural failure. In every report, he wrote the same sentence: accuracy demands faith. To fly a Stuka into a dive was to step off the world. The pilot would cut the throttle, flip the siren lever, and push the stick forward until the horizon disappeared. The earth filled the windshield, rushing upward at nearly 500 kilometers per hour. Gravity pinned the pilot into his seat. The controls shook violently. Oxygen thinned. At 1,500 feet, he pulled the lever that released the bomb. A sudden thud, a flash of light, then hauled back with every ounce of strength before the ground swallowed him whole. It took less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds between life and death, and the difference was nerve. American engineers could never understand that part. In their reports, they noted extreme pilot exposure to high-G stress and probable psychological conditioning. But to the Germans, it wasn't conditioning. It was faith. Stuka training schools taught more theology than tactics. Recruits were told that courage, not armor, was their shield. Instructors quoted Clausewitz and the Bible in the same breath. Fear is the enemy's weapon, and God despises cowards. The aircraft's simplicity reinforced the lesson. You trusted your comrades, your instruments, and your dive, nothing else. Many pilots spoke of an almost religious sensation during the descent, a moment when the screaming sirens erased thought, when time slowed, and every sense sharpened to a knife edge. Some described it as becoming one with the machine. Others called it madness. Rudel called it freedom. By 1943, Rudel and his comrades were flying on the Eastern Front, where the Stuka found its last true battlefield. Over the endless plains of Russia, the dive bomber regained its purpose it had lost in the West. Soviet tanks and artillery columns had nowhere to hide. The Stuka, vulnerable in the air, was once again supreme in the dive. Rudel became a legend, the eagle of the East. He destroyed bridges, convoys, even battleships. The Soviets cursed his name over their radios. Yet his victories came at a cost. His squadron suffered horrific losses. Crews went out in the morning and never returned. Those who did often came back shot full of holes, their planes patched together with scrap and prayer. In his memoir, Rudel admitted, "We fly machines that break before we do." That line captured everything the Americans later realized. German engineering had built the Stuka from steel and fear, but the only thing holding it in the air was human stubbornness. When Allied forces overran Luftwaffe airfields in North Africa and Italy, they sometimes found diary fragments left in cockpits. One, written in pencil on the back of a map, read, "Our aircraft is slow, but our hearts are fast. We dive because we must. We dive because the world is on fire, and we were born to fall." Another, recovered from a wreck near Benghazi, contained a sketch of a Stuka with the caption, "Not metal, spirit." These notes struck the American examiners more deeply than any technical diagram. Captain Harkness, the engineer who had first measured the Stuka's armor, wrote in his own report, "The fear this aircraft inspired came from its pilots, not its construction. Their faith made it strong. Ours is the privilege of fighting men who believe so completely in the impossible. To the Allies, that faith was both admirable and horrifying. They respected the courage, but pitied the delusion. For the Luftwaffe, though, it was all that remained. As 1943 wore on, the Stuka's obsolescence became undeniable. New American fighters filled the Mediterranean skies, faster and deadlier with every month. The Stuka's once terrifying dive became a suicide mission. Entire squadrons were wiped out. The sirens of the Jericho trumpets grew silent. And yet, the pilots still flew. They had been told since 1939 that the Stuka was sacred, that it was the sword of Germany, the sound of divine judgment. They could no more abandon it than abandon their own faith. Rudel, wounded 5 times, kept flying until the final months of the war. When Germany surrendered, he limped into captivity with one leg gone and a record of more than 2,500 missions. To him, the Stuka was still a holy instrument. He never flew a better machine, he told his captors. The Americans didn't argue. They had seen the wrecks, the thin metal, the broken bolts, and they knew he wasn't talking about the aircraft. He was talking about the belief that had kept it alive. In the desert, those same wrecks still gleamed under the sun. Sand blew through open cockpits, covering gauges and dials. Birds nested in the fuselages. The engineers who had studied them were long gone, but every so often, Allied pilots flying overhead swore they could still see their shadows stretching across the dunes, black gull-shaped silhouettes gliding silently below. Faith had kept the Stuka aloft long after physics said it should have fallen. But faith has limits, and the next phase of the war would prove that no amount of belief could protect thin metal from the future. The myth of the Iron Vulture was about to end, not in fire, but in revelation. By the time 1944 arrived, the Stuka scream, once the war's most terrifying sound, had faded into memory. What had begun as the voice of blitzkrieg was now the death rattle of a dying empire. Over Normandy, over the hedgerows of France, the Luftwaffe barely existed. The few remaining Stukas, painted in fading camouflage, were thrown into desperate night raids or anti-tank missions on the Eastern Front. Against swarms of P-51 Mustangs and Yak-9s, they didn't stand a chance. Many never made it back from their first sortie. Others were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The Iron Vulture had become a ghost. But far from the battlefields, in quiet hangars and workshops across England and the United States, its story was being rewritten, not by pilots, but by engineers. In 1944, at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, a battered U-87D captured in North Africa was reassembled piece by American technicians. The aircraft had been shipped across the Atlantic in crates, its wings warped, its engine half-seized, its cockpit smeared with sand and oil. On the tail, someone had scrawled in chalk, "Desert Buzzard." Captain William Harkness, the same man who had first touched the Stuka's thin armor at Kasserine, was there again, clipboard in hand. This time, the study would be methodical and complete. Every rivet, every weld, every flaw was cataloged. They tested the landing gear, crude shock absorbers that leaked hydraulic fluid under weight. They examined the propeller system, reliable but primitive. They measured the cockpit armor once more, 5 millimeters at the thickest point, only around the pilot's headrest. The rest of the fuselage, 3 millimeters, thinner than a dime. Harkness turned to his men. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the armor that conquered Europe." They laughed, not mockingly, but in disbelief. When they powered up the aircraft's radio, the signal barely reached across the hangar. The frequency dial was stiff, the wires crudely soldered. A technician from Bell Aircraft shook his head. He said, "They built these by hand. by hand. We build by thousand." Then they started the engine. The old Jumo 211 sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, a deep, uneven growl that shook dust from the rafters. The smell of oil filled the hangar. The mechanics grinned. "She's ugly, but she's got soul." They ran tests for weeks, pushing the engine, measuring stresses on the wings, checking dive brake performance. The results were always the same: outdated, overworked, overpraised. The Stuka was a machine that had been obsolete the day it was born, yet had changed the shape of modern war through the psychology it unleashed. The final American technical report, published in late 1944, was blunt. The U-87 is a purpose-built dive bomber whose effectiveness derives primarily from tactical surprise and enemy inferiority. Structurally fragile, poorly armored, and lacking in speed, it depends on control and pilot skill rather than technical superiority. Its legend exceeds its design. British analysts at Farnborough came to the same conclusion. They stripped down another wreck recovered from the Libyan desert, discovering wooden reinforcements hidden beneath the fuselage skin, a desperate weight-saving measure. We were expecting the claws of a tiger. Instead, we found the bones of a bird. Yet even as the myth collapsed in the laboratories, its shadow lingered. Allied soldiers who had faced the Stuka in 1939 or 1940 still spoke of it with a kind of haunted respect. The sound of those sirens, that scream, had burrowed too deep into the human memory to be erased by calipers and blueprints. In London, during an air raid exhibit in 1945, a museum installed a recording of the Jericho trumpet. Visitors flinched instinctively when it played. An elderly woman who had survived the Blitz wept and said, "That sound, I can still feel it in my chest." Fear had outlasted the machine. After the war, when Germany lay in ruins, the Stuka's surviving pilots became relics of another age. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the fanatic hero of the Eastern Front, limped across airfields in his one remaining leg and refused to call the aircraft anything but sacred. It was never the metal that mattered. It was the man, he told interviewers. He wasn't wrong. The engineers at Wright Field agreed, though for different reasons. In his final summary, Captain Harkness wrote, "We learned something from the Stuka, not about design, but about illusion. Fear can make weakness look like strength. Faith can turn scrap metal into a symbol, and sometimes that's more dangerous than armor." In the following years, many of the captured Stukas were scrapped. A few were sent to museums, one to the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, another to the National Air and Space Museum, and a handful scattered in forgotten storage hangars. The rest disappeared, buried under the progress of jet-age technology. But one lesson endured: terror is an engineering of the mind. The Stuka had been the first aircraft in history built as much for sound as for destruction. Its Jericho trumpets were the blueprint for psychological warfare, a recognition that fear could be more precise than any bomb sight. In 1945, as Allied troops marched through the wreckage of the Reich, a war correspondent came across a line of abandoned aircraft outside a shuttered Luftwaffe hangar in Bavaria. Among them lay the skeleton of a Stuka, wings torn, fuselage rusted, propeller half buried in mud. Someone had written on the side of its fuselage in chalk, "Ich war nur ein Werkzeug." I was only a tool. He took a photo. That image would later appear in Life magazine, captioned, "The machine that made men tremble." Years later, visitors at aviation museums would stand before those angular wings and ask the same question the American engineers had asked in Tunisia. How could something so thin, so fragile, have terrified the world? And the answer whispered by history, was simple, because it screamed louder than truth. The Stuka's armor was never thicker than a few millimeters. Its strength was never in its steel. It lived and it killed on faith, the faith of its pilots and the fear of those who heard it coming. When the war ended, the engineers put away their notes, and the desert reclaimed the wrecks. But somewhere, high above the memory of the 20th century, that sound still lingers, the cry of metal and madness echoing through time. The iron vulture was never iron after all. It was noise, courage, and illusion. And together, they were enough to terrify the world.